the information in the past few days, and I hope for today's session it will be really fruitful for everyone. And we are running on a really tight schedule. We only have 45 minutes in total, and we have a lineup of 5 excellent speakers, 1 virtual and 4 present here. And each speaker will have 7 minutes for the presentation, and at the end of the session, we're gonna have 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you have any burning questions, we will strongly encourage that you save it till the end of the session to allow sufficient and more in-depth communication here. So now, I do need to remind the audience that the Q&A can also be submitted via the online conference platform, or you can just here, like, stand behind the microphone to ask a question at the end of the session. So we're running on a tight schedule, so let's start. And for the first speaker, we have Zhao Xuhao from China, and his topic is really interesting. It's on the validity, feasibility, and effectiveness of a voice recognition-based digital cognitive screening for dementia and MCI case finding in the Chinese community. So without further ado, the first speaker online.
Hi everyone, my name is Xuhao Zhao. I'm a PhD student from Zhejiang University. Today, I'm going to introduce our recent study entitled Validity, Feasibility, and Effectiveness of a Voice Recognition-Based Digital Cognitive Screener for Dementia and Mild Cognitive Impairment in Community-Dwelling Older Chinese Adults, a large-scale implementation study. With the largest population of dementia patients in the world, China's healthcare system is facing a significant burden. Early identification of dementia leads to better allocation of healthcare resources and provides an optimal window for intervention. However, traditional cognitive screenings are often subjective, influenced by human bias, and frequently add to the workload of healthcare professions. With the development of modern electronic technology, digital cognitive screening tools now provide new opportunities for more accessible evaluations, especially in community settings. To eliminate the involvement of professionally trained testers, we developed a voice recognition-based brief digital cognitive tool called the DCS, which runs on mobile devices. Our previous pilot proof of concept research found a good feasibility and validity of the DCS in detecting dementia. Therefore, conducting the DCS among community-dwelling elderly individuals shows promise in facilitating large-scale cognitive screenings. Recently, to improve the voice recognition ability of the DCS, we upgraded its automatic speech recognition system with a new MMU model. Therefore, further validation of the upgraded voice recognition system is necessary. Additionally, the validity of the DCS needed to be further investigated with a large-scale population. Most importantly, the cost-effectiveness of the DCS for large-scale implementation remains unknown. Therefore, in this study, we investigated the psychometric properties, administrative efficiency, and implementation feasibility of the DCS for dementia and MCI in a large community of elderly participants. We hypothesized that the DCS would show good psychometric properties, have a high completion rate and short conduct time, and show better screening efficacy compared to traditional screening tools such as MoCA and MMC. This study consists of 2 phases. In phase 1, we recruited 11,565 elderly participants aged 50 and above from 14 communities and 2 primary healthcare centers in China. We conducted the DCS test and collected medical information, including demographics and medical history. Then, 337 participants who completed phase 1 were invited to phase 2, the validation phase, where they underwent comprehensive neuropsychological tests, clinical dementia rating score, and functional assessments. Here are the sample characteristics at 2 phases. As you can see, The DCS scores were significantly different among participants who were non-cognitively impaired, mildly cognitively impaired, and demented. According to Table 2, the mean conduct time and completion rate of the DCS ranged from 5.8 to 6.1 minutes, and from 96.4 to 98.2% across different gender, age, and education groups, indicating that the DCS was feasible among different demographic subgroups. Results from our correlation analysis showed that the scores on the DCS were significantly associated with global cognitive Z-scores. Additionally, the DCS had good discriminating validity for both dementia and MCI. As you can see from the Table 3, there was no significant difference in the AUCs among different age and education stratified subgroups. This graph shows the results from our cost consequences analysis. By assuming a stepwise MCI and dementia detecting strategy, which is seen as an effective way for community-based cognitive screening, we compared the screening efficacy of the DCS with MMSE and MoCA. Results showed that the DCS was more time-consuming compared to MMSE and MoCA for detection of each dementia and MCI case. In conclusion, our findings demonstrated that the DCS was an effective and efficient tool for case finding of dementia and MCI in a Chinese community. The large-scale implementation of the DCS among older Chinese adults could be a practical cognitive screening strategy to improve the management of healthcare resources. In the future, we look forward to validating the DCS across different regions in China, particularly in rural areas. This study was supported by the School of Public Health, Zhejiang University, and the Damo Group of Alibaba. I also want to express my gratitude to my instructor, Dr. Xu Xin, for her guidance. Thank you for your watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, that's the first speaker, and I've got to mention that the first project and the first speaker is part of our research group, so if you have any questions, I'll be here. I'll be happy to take them. The next speaker, we have Dr. Valeria Baldiviso from the States, and her topic is interesting. It's about the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative Flagship site. So, yes, Doctor.
Good morning. Today I'm going to be presenting our study in collaboration with the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative for detection of early Alzheimer's disease at Advent Health. I have nothing to disclose. The Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is a flagship study on healthcare system preparedness for early detection of Alzheimer's disease, and Advent Health was one of 7 sites globally, along with Mexico, Jamaica, Japan, Brazil, and Scotland, and it evaluated we included in our study patients that are 65 and older without a diagnosis of dementia. Our primary objective was to identify 65 and older individuals with cognitive impairment, and we did it through a digital cognitive assessment followed by an in-person cognitive assessment, the Montreal Cognitive MoCA test, and to assess the likelihood of having amyloid pathology measured by the PrecivityAD blood test. Our secondary outcome was to analyze primary care physicians' attitude and confidence on screening and diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, and to prepare our healthcare system for a systematic approach to early detect and diagnose Alzheimer's disease. We enrolled 65 and older individuals in our study, and we did it through 2 main pathways, our primary care physician and our social media direct-to-consumer pathway. During our primary care physician pathway, we visited primary care physicians and we educate them about the importance of early detection. They were asked to encourage 65 and older individuals to participate in the test, and ultimately they had access to our results, the study results, and were able to continue to follow up on the patients or to refer them to a memory disorder clinic or a neurologist for further evaluation. During our social media pathway, we utilize direct mail in English and Spanish, community outreach and engagement, social media press, social ads, and patient testimonials. And we encourage patients to complete a computer-based cognitive assessment under the website brainhealthflorida.com, which was also provided in Spanish. We had 4% of our patients came from our primary care physician pathway, and 96 came from our social media direct-to-consumer pathway. We included 65 and older individuals without a diagnosis on dementia, and we asked them to complete an online cognitive assessment, the Cogstate Brief Battery. The CBB is a rapid and reliable digital cognitive test that assesses psychomotor function, attention, learning, and working memory. And the results are standardized in a scale with an age-adjusted mean and divided into normal, borderline, and abnormal. Borderline and abnormal individuals were eligible to continue in the study, and they were asked to come to a research institute for an in-person cognitive assessment followed by a blood test. We utilize the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is used for early detection of MCI and dementia, and it assesses attention, concentration, executive functions, conceptual thinking, memory, language, calculation, and orientation. And that was followed by a blood test, the PrecivityAD test, which is a blood biomarker that uses mass spectrometry. It measures amyloid beta 42/40 ratio and determines the ApoE status. It estimates an amyloid probability score, the APS, which represents the likelihood from 0 to 100 of having amyloid on a PET scan. We also did other metabolic tests. A total of 1,076 patients consented to participate in the study. 4.2% came from our primary care pathway, and 95.8% came from our directed consumer social media pathway. Of those, 742 actually completed the first online cognitive test, the Cogstate Brief Battery. Of those, 324 were eligible to come to our research institute, which were the ones that had a borderline or abnormal test. Of those, 225 participants visited our research institute. Of those, 219 actually completed the MoCA test. Of those, 98 show impairment in the MoCA test. And of those 98, 42 show a high amyloid probability score on their PrecivityAD blood test. This figure represents the correlation in between the MoCA test and the amyloid probability scores. The blue color are normal MoCA scores compared with the green abnormal MoCA score, and the horizontal line is showing the different APS score, which goes from a low, intermediate to a high score. And we can see here that most of our normal MoCA score show a low probability score, but also most of our participants that had an abnormal MoCA score, 65, show a low APS score. And that compare with 24 participants with a normal MoCA and a high amyloid probability score, and 17 with an abnormal MoCA showing a high APS score. 14 normal MoCA show an intermediate indeterminate APS score, and only 15 of our abnormal MoCA had an intermediate APS score. And this was not statistically significant. There wasn't any statistically significant relationship between the MoCA and the APS category. Some of the challenges that we encountered during this study was engaging primary care physicians for screening and diagnosis. Participants continuing in the study after the digital cognitive assessment, and the difficulties using a computer-based cognitive test, as well as a high drop-off rate from website visits to actually e-consent and participate in the study. Some of the learnings from the study are that we need to expand our education to primary care physicians and patients regarding the importance of early detection, the need for the development of diagnostic guidelines, increase in support system and resources, that we need to start an early conversation about brain health and lifestyle changes, and increase research to show evidence of importance of early detection. And our conclusion shows our success of the direct-to-consumer approach in study recruitment. No statistically significant relationship between the MoCA impairment and the APS categories, that the MoCA alone is insufficient to identify Alzheimer's disease in persons with cognitive impairment, and that a comprehensive clinical evaluation along with blood biomarkers can lead to early detection and early access to new medical treatments. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. For our next speaker, we have Dr. Audrey Gavalli from the States, and talking about the dementia risk stratification. And just a gentle reminder, we want to make sure that the small screen is consistent.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for the introduction, and on behalf of all the co-authors, it's a great privilege to present our findings. Some disclosure. As you know, subjective cognitive complaint is a very sensitive indicator of cognitive decline and may represent an increased risk of MCI, AD, and other related dementia. Of course, the SCC, as you know, is a very heterogeneous group, with some of them could evolve and decline and present MCI and AD. But it's very sometimes difficult to identify those participants at risk, and it's very a challenge. So using digital health technology, decentralized trials, remote design, and also wearable, it's maybe possible to identify at a population level those individuals at risk. And it will be also a great opportunity to try to identify the role of digital biomarker inside the other biomarker landscape within the AD continuum. So that we are doing with our partner Apple. So we deploy the Intuition study. Actually, we enrolled 23,000 participants with iPhone and Apple Watch. It's a US-based population from 21 to 86 years old participants that are agreed to participate and give time and commitment to different health medical survey, but also to be able to deploy cognitive unsupervised tests from the Contab battery, and also active and passive feature information to be able to analyze their behavior. So from the 23,000 participants, we have a specific targeted population on the subjective cognitive complaint, and that I will show you the result. So there is three objectives for the ancillary study on subjective cognitive complaint. The first one is really to determine the feasibility to do a large cohort of SCC with a fully remote design, to decipher the demographic, clinical, and neuropsychological characteristics of those populations, and also to better define the phenotype, the sort of taxonomy of the SCC that's leading to the heterogeneity of the SCC, using stratification with a higher risk or additional risk factor, such as familial history, cardiovascular risk factor, and also a more objective cognitive profile that is measured with unsupervised cognitive Contab battery. Our population, so we define in Intuition the SCC group based on 50 years old plus, and self-report cognitive symptoms from the cognitive function instruments, so the CFI-14 that is clinically validated with a threshold of 4. And we 2-to-1 age and indicated a match compared to control. Also from the Intuition study, the control are unimpaired participants participant, cognitively unimpaired participant without no MCI or no dementia. So the first result is really the feasibility. In 9 months, we are able to recruit 2,000 SCC participants. It's really a question of engagement, and it's quite impressive that the SCC participants are really engaged, not only to give us time for the different survey about medical history, cognition, and psychological profile, but also to fulfill monthly the CONTAB battery with 5 tests and 30 minutes of test. And the great adherence also with longitudinal data. The first part is also dedicated to the demography and the characteristic of such population. So we want to identify if we can't, in quote, trust in this type of population that it's fully remote enrolled. And as you can see, there is a similar aspect on the characteristics that we can find in other cohorts, that it's a clinically setting-based cohort of SCC. But what is also very interesting, if we are able to enroll almost 30% of the underrepresentative population. And also it seems that there is no barrier about the income, even if it's fully digital using iPhone and Apple Watch method and design. The other aspect is dedicated to the cognitive and psychological profile. So of course, as you can see, there is a higher mean score of the CFI-14 because it's the score that defines the SCC group. But we can also identify the sort of profile inside the SCC that is clearly related to memory and also to forgetting some languages aspect. There is also clearly a higher burden in terms of anxiety and in terms of depression, and also a higher level of ECOG-12 that measures the everyday cognitive relevant functional activity. Regarding the health and habit survey, clearly also there is a great burden. The perception of sleep quality and quantity is poor in the SCC. There is clearly a more sedentary and less mobility profile, and they use more medication and more substance related to alcohol and tobacco. When we look to the dementia risk factor, there is also clearly numerically a higher prevalence of all the modifiable and non-modifiable risk factor, and on the SCC in particular for the cardiovascular risk factor. Then we stratify by familial history. Of course, it's a fully remote design, so the familial history is defined by self-report positive first degree relative with dementia. In our cohort, in the SCC, there is 38% of SCCs that report a positive familial history and 5% that report at least 2 cases. When we compare the SCC with and without familial history, they are more likely to be older, retire, with this hyperlipidemia profile and any type of cardiological diagnosis. When we look to the cardiovascular risk factor, that it's defined in our study by at least 2 cardiovascular self-reports, cardiovascular and metabolic condition, we have in the cohort 50% of the SCCs that report a such profile. And compared to no cardiovascular risk factor, they are more likely to be older, retire, male, and have an history of anxiety. Then we want to assess the objective cognitive profile, and we use the CONTAB battery. Of course, I don't have time, unfortunately, to describe all the tests that we are doing, but globally it's map all the different cognitive tests, and we have selected 5 of them that are really relevant to identify the MCI population. And when we do that, clearly there is some tests that are able to show a difference between the FEC and the control. In particular, for working memory, attentional process, and some learning that seems more sensitive to detect deficit inside the subjective cognitive complaint. So to conclude, we show and underline the feasibility to have a larger SCC cohort in a fully remote design, the validity of the cohorts that is quite similar to what we could expect in the data literature in a clinical setting, but also the ability to recruit underrepresentative population. And clearly our SCC population show a greater burden in different cognitive, functional, and behavioral aspects. And with unsupervised cognitive battery, we are also able to identify some difference between the SCC and the control. So the next step for us is to analyze longitudinal data and to objective the cognitive trajectory of our SCC, and also to look to the passive feature with the Apple Watch that could identify some at-risk population. And thank you for your attention, and I would like also to thank the participants for their time and commitment, and also thanks the Intuition team that's just such amazing work to be able to reach the goals that we expect, and also the scientific committee for their time, commitment, and amazing work together, and of course our Apple partner. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gabali, for the massive amount of work that she just introduced. And for the next speaker, we have Dr. Pieter van der Veer from the Netherlands talking about predicting cognitive decline in amyloid-positive patients.
Thank you. These are the disclosure of the Alzheimer's Center. As we all know, AD is a progressive disease by definition, and when we give patients their diagnosis, the first thing they want to know is what can we expect to make future decisions surrounding their care. And if we ask them what they want to know specifically about their disease progression, they tell us that they find their cognitive function in the future to be the most important part of their disease progression. And thus we set up a project to predict natural MSE trajectories for patients with MCI and mild dementia, which is especially important in the context of the new disease-modifying treatments that are coming to market. We did this work in the Amsterdam Dementia Cohort, which is an ongoing real-world clinical data cohort where we provide one-day standardized diagnostic workups, which include a medical history, physical tests, cognitive tests, a lumbar puncture, and an MRI. And then we try to follow up our patients annually, and during this follow-up we also do MMSE measurements. From this cohort, we included participants with MCI or mild dementia who were amyloid positive on CSF or PET and had at least one baseline and one follow-up MSE measurements, and this netted roughly 1,000 participants, of which a third had MCI. What kind of modeling did we do in this study? We used linear mixed models to predict MMSE over time, and we used a host of different predictors, including MMSE at baseline, ApoE, CSF measurements, MRI, and various demographic and vascular risk factors. For all these factors, we included interactions of the predictors with time to see if the MMSE decline trajectory changed. We modeled MCI and mild dementia separately, and we did backward selection to reduce parameters, and we used internal cross-validation to see how well our model performs. Before I go on to the modeling, first a little bit about the cohort. The Amsterdam Dementia Cohort is a relatively young cohort. As you can see, the average age is 65, genders are relatively well balanced, and the MCI population, well, obviously has a higher baseline cognitive function in mild dementia, and there is a larger spread in baseline MMSE in the mild dementia population, 2 years of follow-up on average. Then onto the modeling. On the left here, I show you the interaction, the predictors that have an interaction with time, so that modulates the decline trajectories, and we see that different predictors were selected in the MCI and mild dementia populations. In MCI, CSF amyloid beta, p-tau, and sex were selected, and in mild dementia, age, MSE at baseline, ApoE, and CSF amyloid were found to modulate the MSE decline over time. So only CSF amyloid was selected in both populations. On the right, you see the performance of the model in internal validation, and in general, we find that we can predict MSE decline to some extent, but there is still unexplained variability, and that means that there will be uncertainty in predictions, which is always difficult for patients to understand and also difficult for clinicians to explain. So I think that the conceptually easiest way to think about this is to look at the median absolute deviations, which you can see in MCI is 2.1, which means that in half the predictions, the predictive error, so how much the predictions are off, is below 2.1 MMSE points. And for mild dementia, in half the predictions in the internal validations, the predictive error is below 2.8. So you can take these predictive errors with you as I show you what do these predictions actually look like. So in the Amsterdam dementia cohort, these are the predicted MMSE declines for all the patients we included. And you see that we predict quite a large amount of inter-individual variation in predicted MMSE. And against this background predictions, you can show for an individual patient a prediction. So say we have a patient which is representative of the MCI cohort with a baseline MMSE of 28, then their predicted cognitive decline will look something like this on average, and after 5 years, their predicted MMSE will be 23. Say we now have interventions with a 30% effectiveness, then we can use these models to extrapolate or calculate what their MMSE decline would look like then. And then their curve will look something like this, and you can again plot this against the background, and then after 5 years their MMSE will not be, their predicted MMSE will not be 23, but about 25. But what does it actually mean to have an MMSE of 23 or 25? How do you think about this type of modeling? How do you try to explain this type of modeling? We thought this was quite difficult, so we came up with the same solution as you've seen in the donanemab talk on Monday. We thought, well, it will be easier to think about a time to some sort of threshold. So for this, we picked a time to the next cognitive stage, which we said, well, let's take an MMSE of 20, which correlates with a moderate dementia. And for the patient I've just shown you, you can calculate what their expected time would be, predicted time would be to reach this MMSE of 20. So on the x-axis, you see the time to reach an MMSE of 20 in years. And for this patient I just showed you, their predicted time will be 6.5 years. And then again, you can make the step we just took at the previous slide and say, well, if we have an intervention with a 30% effectiveness, how much time would they gain to reach this MMSE of 20? And we see that you would gain almost 3 years, assuming that the treatment effect is stable over time. Now you can make this graph varying all the predictors that we included in the model. So we thought it would be illustrative to vary over the baseline cognition and the amount of amyloid burden that patients have. So that is what you see in the next slide, fixing all the other predictors. You see that as the amyloid burden increases, so the CSF amyloid decreases and the baseline cognition measured by MMSE decreases, that the amount of time it would take patients on average to reach this MMSE of 20 decreases, and thus the effectiveness of any intervention also modulates with the predicted time to reach an MMSE of 20. In conclusion, we developed models to predict MMSE over time in MCI and mild dementia. We found that MCI and mild dementia should be modeled separately. There is fairly large unexplained variability, which necessitates communication to both clinicians using the model and patients gleaming their predicted decline. MMSE trajectories can be shown both as curves or as a time to reach an MMSE score, and models and graphs can be used as conversation starters to discuss prognosis and potential intervention effects. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Wiesje van der Vlier, especially, as you see on the slide, one of my supervisors, and Hans Berkhoff.